genre, such as tragedy or epic. Tragedy is a particularly identifiable genre. Not all ancient genres are particularly easy to pin down. Very difficult to pin down what oratory is, for example, and how it works exactly. The sort of taxonomy of prose genres in the ancient world in particular is very complicated. Verse tends to get done by meter, but everybody recognises something, a tragedy, effectively, when they see one. It's in iambic trimeters, except when it's sung. People perform it wearing masks and costumes. Bad things happen, and so on. You can also, if you're a writer of the stature of Herodotus, employ what I would call tragic patterning, and what a lot of people have called tragic patterning, even though perhaps it's a little bit pushing things a bit to identify it so firmly as tragedy when it comes in Herodotus, but the sense of inevitable ghastliness hanging over some of Herodotus's characters, particularly in the first book around Croesus, for example. This is very much, you can imagine someone writing a play called Croesus. As a matter of fact, somebody did write a play called Gyges. And you can see how the tragic tropes that one's familiar with from all the mythological tragedies one's read could be deployed to tell the story of these figures. By the time you get to Plutarch and others, contemporaries of his, Diodorus of Sicily, on the death of Philip II of Macedon, really let rip with his tragic imagery, tragic patterning, tragic illusion. You can really feel a sense of a connection with the dramatic genre being used to introduce more depth into the account of events. Now, I've described it in sort of rather flattering terms. I've said it introduces depth. There are some people who would say that it introduces an undesirable element of fictionality into a historical account. There were a group of people whom Polybius was very cross with, called the tragic historians, who really seem to have gone to town on the old tragic illusion and generic enrichment in such a way that mightily disturbed Polybius. That said, one can see how the turbulence of Hellenistic and Roman political life could be seen as imitating art, and specifically the art of tragedy, which concerns itself with kings and heroes, big people who suffer and sin very mightily. Nothing small or unimportant happens in a tragedy. It's all writ large. And by the time you get to someone like Philip of Macedon, you are getting that, as it were, in the way he behaves. And of course, one of the reasons Diodorus Siculus is so taken with describing Philip's death is that it actually happens in a theatre, and he's dressed up as the 13th Olympian. Who thought that was a good idea? You know, and of course, it's an absolute gift to somebody like Diodorus, who goes through it all. And yet, it is a historical happening. You can even go and look at the theatre. And although there are plenty of questions that we don't know the answers to surrounding that historical event, there isn't really very much doubt that that Philip was murdered in a theatre, which puts him in company also, of course, with Caligula and other luminaries on the Roman side, with whose fate Plutarch would have been acquainted. So when I first started thinking about this, those were sort of the terms that I thought about it in. But then I studied it further, and I think there are more layers to Plutarch's engagement with tragedy than I've sketched in what I've written about it so far, and more questions to be asked. So today I would like to look at some texts, some less familiar, some more familiar, and try and give a sort of reasonably rounded view of all the different ways in which Plutarch operates tragedy. I think one thing that has arisen is the question whether Plutarch is engaging with whole tragedies at all. If you're going to espouse an interpretation which suggests that the lives are persistently alluding to the same tragedy, it matters whether or not Plutarch's read the whole thing or whether he's just read little bitty bits. It's quite possible that some of Plutarch's many tragic quotations, which we don't know the context of, for example, could possibly not be doing much more than saying in an elegant way something which he once said, rather in the way that a modern writer might quote from Shakespeare, and you might say, to this favour shall she come, without intending anybody to remember the whole of Hamlet. You can do that. There were anthologies of tragedy for at least 300 years by Plutarch's day. And Matthew Wright has done some very interesting work on the quotation culture of Greek writers under Rome. I don't go all the way with that, but I think it's very well worth thinking about. And there have also been suggestions that references to the performance of tragedy in Plutarch's day, in fact, might denote the performance of extracts from tragedy rather than whole tragedies. So both of those trends in scholarship might mitigate against the sort of tragic patterning and the significance of tragic quotations that I, in my very first article ever, suggested might be operating in the Alexander. However, I would like to at least partially defend that position. Just because anthologies exist doesn't mean to say that the whole works weren't available. We know they were. And it certainly doesn't mean that Plutarch hadn't read them. And Sebastiana Novena has convincingly demonstrated that in terms of public theatre, as opposed to private occasions or exceptional concert performers like Nero, we're talking about performances of complete plays in Plutarch's day, especially in quite sort of culturally prestigious locations, such as he would have been familiar with, like Delphi and Athens. And I think there's certainly evidence from within his text that Plutarch thought of tragedy as a performance. So let me just go to this text. On eating meat, two, son of on eating meat. It's a short essay, and it's fragmentary, and it has this quotation in it from Euripides' Cresphontes. And the thing I'd like to draw your attention to is that this is one of those plays where mother almost kills son, a bit like the Ion, which we have all of. So she raises her axe against her son because she believes him to be that son's murderer, one of those constant misunderstandings that occurs in tragedy, and says, "This blow I give you is more costly yet." What a stir she rouses in the theatre as she brings them to their feet in terror, lest she wound the youth before the old man can stop her. Now, I submit that that suggests that people did go to the theatre, because unless it's completely insulated from any form of reality, which I don't think makes any sense, it certainly suggests an audience. The people rise to their feet, and it also suggests to me that it's actually not an extract, because any Hitchcock fan will tell you that in order to make something suspenseful, you have to build it up. The Cresphontes has quite a complicated plot. If they were only watching that scene, I think they'd be completely confused. I don't think anybody would get up in terror. The whole thing requires a build-up. Now, one can compare and contrast. Oh no, I just wanted to show you that. Actually, that's the theatre in Chaeronea, Plutarch's hometown. It was rectilinear for much of its history, and then it was made rounder later on. It's a bit tumble down and a little bit small, but it's quite an attractive theatre, I think, and I think it's probably worth pointing out that Chaeronea did have a theatre. Now we have another way of engaging with tragedy at roughly the same period, Dio of Prosa, Dio Chrysostom, Oration 52. This is a very nice picture of life in the long Roman afternoon of the 2nd century. Having risen about the first hour of the day, you see poor old Dio gets up and he's not feeling very well, and it's a bit chilly, and so he goes for a little ride in his carriage for a bit of fresh air, and then he takes a stroll and rest, and then he has a rub down and a bath and a light breakfast. I fell to reading certain tragedies. So I was feasting my eyes on the spectacle portrayed by these dramas. It's all 3 Philoctetes plays. Aeschylus' Philoctetes, which we don't have, Sophocles' Philoctetes, which we do have, Euripides' Philoctetes, which we don't have. Look at how he describes reading these through. I was feasting my eyes on the spectacle portrayed by these dramas, so even when he's reading it, he thinks of it as a spectacle. And figuring to myself that even if I'd been in Athens, I could not have witnessed such a contest as this of those distinguished poets. On the contrary, while there were some who did, most people couldn't, because probably the tragic poets seldom or never competed against one another with plays on the same theme. And so I was evidently having a rare treat, a novel solace for my illness. Accordingly, I played Choragus for myself in very brilliant style, and tried to pay close attention as if I were a judge passing judgment on the premier tragic choruses. So this is all, of course, totally divorced from performance, except that he is recreating performance. He can't go and see a fully staged performance, but he is thinking about the plays as plays, and he is reading them all the way through. I played Choragus for myself as an interesting expression. The Athenian magistrates who brought on the tragedies, the choregoi, had to be very rich and tended to be very influential, and they paid for the costumes and all the props and so on and so forth. It was a very big liturgy in 5th century Athens. And there he is, he has this sense of control that the choregos has. I'm producing it, I'm getting people to do things, I'm in my head costuming and propping people. I think it's rather a nice way of thinking about how tragedy might be read, even if you can't see it on the stage. But there is another side to tragedy, of course. There's the spectacle, but there are reasons for Plutarch both to be very familiar with it and to feel uncomfortable about being familiar with it. Tragedy was widely used in Greek education, but Plato disapproved of tragedy even more than of other poetry, its dramatic and therefore ultra-mimetic form making it particularly pernicious. And Plutarch was a devoted Platonist. So in the next passage, How to Study Poetry, he modifies Plato's rejection of tragic poetry and poetry generally, and elides Plato's distinction between poetic types. It may be said, not only of the land of the Egyptians, but also of poetry, that it yields drugs, and some are good when mixed and others baneful to those who cultivate it. And that line, drugs, that's a quotation from the Odyssey, and hidden therein are love and desire and willing converse, suasion that steals away the mind of the very wisest. That's a quotation from the Iliad. So that too is actually a Platonic technique. You are very worried about poetry, but it doesn't stop you quoting it all the time. That way you have your cake and eat it. But if we go on through the passage, you can see that the argument here is essentially that poetry has a superpower which can be used for good as well as evil. It's better to let people experience poetry and decide for themselves about it than to try and keep it away from them. And actually, an appreciation of poetry shows intelligence and sensitivity. The element of deception in it does not gain any hold on utterly witless and foolish persons. This is the ground of Simonides' answer to the man who said to him, "Why are the Thessalians the only people whom you do not deceive?" His answer was that they're too ignorant to be deceived by me. And Gorgias called tragedy a deception wherein he who deceives is more honest than he who does not deceive, and he who is deceived is wiser than he who is not deceived. So essentially, both of them are talking about a sort of contract between the writer and the audience, whereby the audience agrees not to pick out too many holes because of the emotional benefit they get from immersing themselves in the performance. You can see that there's a lot of Homer there, apart from the two quotations. There's also stopping the years of the young as those of the Ithacans were stopped with a hard and unyielding wax. That's, of course, a reference to Odysseus hearing the song of the sirens, making sure his men couldn't hear it, so they just kept rowing, and he was tied to the mast, so he got to hear the song but wasn't killed. So that was a win-win situation. And shall we force them to put to sea in the Epicurean boat and avoid poetry and steer their course clear of it? Or shall we, to paraphrase, let them have a look and make the best possible use of it? So you've got a mixture of quotations, both from epic and lyric, and an allusion to tragedy. And as a matter of fact, the section finally ends with a quotation from Sophocles in a passage that I haven't put on here. That seems to be dismantling Plato's sort of hierarchy of how bad poetry is viewed, which of course where tragedy is the worst view, epic probably the least worse. That's gone. And the argument that it's probably better to be exposed to it under the right circumstances is promoted instead. Still, even so, tragedy can be a dangerous thing. And here we come to Plutarch's account of an early performance. As you see, this comes from the Solon. The Solon is full of slightly dodgy chronological equivalences, some of which are flagged up and some of which aren't. This is one of the dodgier ones, although nothing is actually said about how unlikely it is. It's almost a sort of atmosphere. Who would I meet in 6th century Athens? Well, there'd be Thespis. He'd be doing this. What would Solon think? He would think this. So there we are. Thespis was now beginning to develop tragedy, and the attempt attracted most people because of its novelty. Solon was naturally fond of hearing and learning anything new. He was having a nice time in his old age. He went to see Thespis act in his own play, as the custom of the ancient poets was. But he doesn't like it. I'm not ashamed to tell such lies in the presence of so many people. This is a very, I always think of, has anybody seen the movie Galaxy Quest? Yeah, this is the Galaxy Quest moment. Sorry, Galaxy Quest is about a group of broken down actors from something that's obviously the first series of Star Trek, who get transported by some extremely naive aliens on a precise copy of the set. And there's this terrible moment where, under very stressful circumstances, they have to explain acting to the aliens. And the aliens really don't understand. They're terribly upset, terribly wounded, because they're accustomed to refer to the episodes of the show as the historical documents. And I'm sorry to be frivolous, but actually it does strike me as being an incredibly good parallel for this passage. Thespis says there's no harm in it, whereupon Spolon smote the ground sharply with his staff and said, soon, if we give play of this sort, that's paidia play, much praise and honour, we shall find it in our solemn contracts. And then immediately afterwards, we find that, yes, actually, I'm afraid he's right, because Pisistratus is, you know, life and art are really intersecting. Pisistratus, in the passage before this one, has been acting. Even those virtues which nature had denied him were imitated by him, Mimoumenos, so successfully that he won more confidence than those who actually possessed them. He was thought to be a cautious and order-loving man, one that prized equality above all things and would take it ill if anyone disturbed the existing order and attempted to change. On these points, indeed, he completely deceived most people. But Solon quickly detected his real character and was the first to perceive his secret designs. He did not, however, treat him as an enemy, but tried to soften and mould him by his instruction. He thinks he's a person of some promise. But here we find Pisistratus famously wounding himself, came into the marketplace, tried to exasperate the populace with the charge that his enemies had plotted against his life on account of his political opinions, and he sort of riled them up. Solon has rumbled him, "O son of Hippocrates, you are playing the Homeric Odysseus badly. When he disfigured himself, it was to deceive his enemies, but you do it to mislead your fellow citizens." For a bit of a newbie at drama, I think we have to say that Solon has become a very acute critic of acting. Plutarch, the Platonist, really does come out here, stresses that dissembling is part of drama's genetic makeup. Used without caution, the dramatic is very bad for you. But of course, in Galaxy Quest, the actors do really triumph, so that's all right then. I'm not at all sure what what Plutarch would have made of Galaxy Quest. Now, changing tack a bit here, although it is still connected, the use of metaphor from the tragic stage is extremely common, and it's deployed in a lot of different circumstances. And I really won't have time to do much more than just touch on this now. The acting metaphor in the Solon passage is one of very many. Usually it implies not only falsity, but it's also sometimes inadequacy. And I allow myself this wonderful fragment from Würzburg showing a rather scruffy actor with a receding hairline and an unbeautiful nose who has not had a shave, looking at his mask with this beautiful straight nose and its glorious hair, and he's obviously going to put this on and disappear under it. I'm sure he has a beautiful voice. In the ancient world, it's no good being Tom Cruise if you can't really express yourself by your lovely voice. The Demetrius and the Antony, and I'm going to come on to the Antony a bit later, have long been used as examples of generic enrichment with reference to drama, both comedy and tragedy. The overtness of the alternation between the high tragedy of some aspects of the subject's career, especially Demetrius's fluctuating fortunes, and the low comedy of his sexual encounters, counterpointed by constant references to the Athenian comedy of his day and the metaphorical theatricality of his self-presentation, makes the Demetrius an exemplar of Plutarch's use of drama to enrich character with. He's at least flamboyant, and sometimes really reaches rather more morally significant heights than that. The life and the pair benefit from references to tragedy and comedy, and this is set up by Plutarch right from the beginning of the pair, as Tim Duff has cogently argued. The king as actor is a powerful metaphor, which has exercised strong influence over poets from Shakespeare to Coventry. This is one of everybody's favourite parts of Demetrius, I think. He's not a bad sort, Demetrius. He's not going to make a fuss. He just puts on a dark cloak in place of his stage robes of royalty and steals away unnoticed. And here is Coventry's take on it, when he rewrites it to emphasise Demetrius's nobility. It's not always right to play the king. Sometimes it's much better to change when your fortune changes. Theatrical productions are not only created by actors, though, and this too is sometimes reflected in Plutarch's metaphors. We saw earlier that Dio, as he read his copies of the 3 Philoctetes plays, saw himself as a choregus, a producer of tragedy. In Themistocles 5, oh sorry, I just thought we'd have tragedy and comedy there, just to liven things up. In Themistocles 5, Themistocles acts as a choregus in the real world, in the literal sense. There's the passage, he won a victory with tragedy, so even at that early time, this contest was conducted with great eagerness and ambition, and he set up a tablet. This is a much later stele set up by the Deme of Accione to commemorate 2 much later choregoi, but it seemed to give you a nice visual example of the sorts of thing that Themistocles might have produced. But later, in chapter 10, we hear that he acts in this way. He despaired of bringing the multitude over to his views by any human reasonings. He set up his machinery, ars ten machinae, as in a tragedy, and brought to bear upon them signs from heaven and oracles. So he set up the machinae. I think there's a double meaning there. Machinae, of course, is the crane, which levers the god on at the end of a tragedy to sort stuff out, hence Deus ex machina. It's also part of the domain, I suppose, of the choregos, because it must have been a very expensive thing. So some choregos, choregoi must have stumped up for these things. It's part of the backstage machinery, and therefore the province of the choregos, at least in terms of paying for it. Machina, of course, can also mean a plot device. But the reference to signs from heaven, daimonia, and oracles does seem to imply that we're meant to think of the theatrical machinery there. And it's exactly the same phrase, getting back to what I said about tragic historians at the beginning, is used later in the life, 32:4, about Philaucus, and some fiction that he has arranged. Now, Themistocles' Athenian background certainly makes tragic imagery and patterning appropriate, but tragedy also works as a paradigm outside Athens and outside the Greek lives. Crassus's severed head becomes the star prop in a performance of an excerpt, and this is an excerpt, so that's important, from the Bacchae at the Parthian court after the disastrous battle of Carrhae. The twisted culture of the Parthian court boasts a remarkable level of Hellenism. Hierodes, ignorant of neither the Greek language nor Greek-like writings, and Artabasdes, who actually composed tragedies and wrote orations and histories, some of which are preserved. They're very educated, but the occasion that is described by Plutarch is very, very perverted, basically. This is a long passage, so apologies, but it's worth dwelling over. The poor old Crassus has had his head removed, and the head is brought by one Socrates to the king's door. The tables have been moved apart. This is dinner theatre, after dinner theatre. Jason of Tralles, big star, was singing the part about Agave from the Bacchae of Euripides. Okay, interesting. But he'd evidently just stopped or paused because he was receiving applause. And Socrates turns up, and then he does a proskinesis, and he casts the head of Crassus into the centre of the company. Yeah. The Parthians lifted it up with clapping of hands and shouts of joy, and at the king's bidding, his servants gave Socrates a seat at the banquet. Now, it seems to have one actor and a chorus, this production, and it's not, you know, there's the proskinesis reminds us that we're not anywhere very Greek. It is a barbarian place, and the head is handed round the hall, which I think one has to agree is fairly savage. And at this point we have a problem. Plutarch says, then Jason handed Tymon to Pentheus, sciuo perimeter, to one of the chorus, seized the head of Crassus, and behaving like a bacchant, sang these verses through as if inspired. Now that seems, on any analysis, to represent a disruption of the performance. The translators from Amio onwards, with the honourable exception of the Bude, represent it as extreme. They translate sciuo perimeter as costume. So they're saying that he changes his costume from Agave to Pentheus. Well, hang on, how is any of this working? I mean, it makes more sense in a way if it's Pentheus to Agave, but Pentheus doesn't sing in the Bacchae, so what part could he have been singing? Who sings about Agave? Nobody really does, actually. It's all just a little bit off. It doesn't seem to represent what we know about the play. Probably the word usually translated as costume, sciuo perimeter, should in fact be translated as prop and understood not as Jason's costume, but the stage prop used for the head of Pentheus. So he gets rid of that, and then he's got a better head. But there's still an oddity here. There's almost a continuity error, and that seems to underline not only that this is not a full performance, but the fact that when the actor changes the property master's mask head for a real one, he moves the performance into a register profoundly disturbing, particularly for a Platonist, or even an Aristotelian. The imagined becomes literal in a dangerous and transgressive way. Hence Plutarch's punning use of the term behaving like a bacchant, anabakusas. Agave is a bacchant in the play, albeit a deluded rather than a reverent one. But the term also implies a degree of maddened frenzy, an unholy ecstasy. The paper-thin dramatic illusion is ruptured altogether. In the next bit, you see the chorus of gamely joined in. We bring from the mountain a tendril fresh, you know, and so on. And then we've got who slew him. Mine is the honour. Pomaxathres, well, Pomaxathres is the man who killed Crassus, who happened to be one of the banqueters, sprang up and laid hold of the head and says, "Oi, that's my line," basically. So there we are. Well, that is audience participation, and one doesn't want that in a Greek tragedy. The tragic emotions of pity and fear are replaced with savage delight. Greek paideia, in the form of tragedy, is perverted to the point of horror. In the end, the last part of the chapter, you can see that Crassus is not the only victim here. The point of this ghastly pantomime is not only, or perhaps even mainly, the downfall of a Plutarchian hero, as it might have been if Plutarch had chosen the version of Crassus's death found in Dio, where the Parthians pour molten gold into his mouth in mockery of his greed, just as Cyrus's decapitated head is pushed into a bucket of blood in Herodotus. Rather, this use of tragedy seems aimed at least partly characterising the audience, as well as, rather than really the decapitated Crassus. Who are these people who do this to the text of Euripides? Zadorozhny, I think, and I pretty much agree on this. He says Plutarch's Parthians are dangerously violent readers of Euripides. When Plutarch says, to such an exodion did the generalship of Crassus come, just like a tragedy, he seems to include the Parthians in the cast. So the slayer of Crassus and the actor are both richly rewarded, but then we have our own domestic tragedy in the Parthian court. He kills Serena in jealousy. He loses one son in battle, just as Crassus did, was murdered by another. He really deserves his miserable end. At Table Talk, a passage in the Table Talk, Plutarch recalls a remark of Timaeus about the coincidence that Euripides died on the same day as the tyrant Dionysius of Syracuse was born, or more probably became tyrant, with fate at the same time, as Timaeus says, bringing off the imitator of tragic sufferings and bringing on the one who enacted them. There too, the language underlines the blurring of the proper boundary between life and art. I think I will need to move on a bit more swiftly. I just put that in because they always look like severed heads to me, and also it reminds you what a big performance, a production of a tragedy actually was. So many people necessary. Although that is, of course, a satyr play, but I think the point still holds. Plutarch's quite good at writing his own big scenes, and this, of course, is one of them. I won't go through this, but for one thing, I always cry at the end, which is embarrassing. But you will probably be familiar with this. It shows his tremendous gift for enargeia, for vividness, and also that he knows when less is more. And his accounts, of course, stick in the mind and lend themselves to making tragedies. So Charmian was trying to array fix the crown. Then somebody said in anger, "Find ye this Charmian." And there we have Charmian's response. And here we have a fairly local boy to Coventry, Shakespeare, he doesn't really need to do very much to this. I mean, of course, he does focus on Cleopatra's actual death as opposed to having it done behind closed doors. But the dialogue, we have pretty much the same thing. What work is here? Charmian, is this well done? It is well done, and fitting for a princess descended of so many royal kings. And I allow myself Elizabeth Taylor in full kit, and Iris and Charmian, there we are. Now, Shakespeare did actually produce a number of different tragedies from Plutarch. Julius Caesar, based partly on the Caesar and partly on the Brutus. Antony and Cleopatra, as we've seen. Coriolanus, based on the Coriolanus. But I'd like very briefly at the end just to focus a little on Tymon of Athens, which is primarily based on Antony chapter 70. There's a small little digression in the Antony, and a bit on material from the Alcibiades. I think one of the odd things about Tymon of Athens, I mean, it's probably written by Shakespeare and Thomas Middleton, but it is a tragedy. It has sometimes been described as a problem play, whatever that means. But essentially, it's about a man who gives very generously of himself at the beginning, and then when he loses all his money and also loses all his friends, he becomes extremely embittered. And the discovery of huge amounts of gold doesn't stop him being embittered, and he becomes a recluse. And he does everything he can to hurt society, and he doesn't really engage with anyone except one faithful servant. So here we have Michael Pennington as Tymon, and Rupert Penry Jones and as Alcibiades. And this is chapter 70. So you see Antony's withdrawn after Actium. He compares himself with Tymon because he's been wronged and treated with ingratitude by his friends. And then we hear from Plutarch all about Tymon. There is a very odd little piece of information there. Tymon was an Athenian, as may be gathered from the plays of Aristophanes and Plato, for he is represented in their comedies as peevish and misanthropical. And in fact, I think this whole passage is based not on tragedy, but on comedy. But it's a sort of savage comedy that old comedy was particularly well adapted to. It's been missed by the commentators, who tend to be actually a bit bemused by this passage. And yet it does have some clearly comic, not necessarily funny, but comic traits. And you see that actually in the second half of the chapter. Apemantus is Tymon's straight man. Apemantus said, "Tymon, what a fine symposium ours is. It would be," said Tymon, "if you weren't here." And you know, it's all the sort of thing that you might have expected not to be turned into a tragedy. But in Shakespeare's hands, and because he does all sorts of different things to it, and particularly produces this storyline where he finds all this money and uses it, instead of being happy again, he uses it to destroy people, is quite striking, I think. I'm not going to call it a failure of reading by Shakespeare. I just think that it's an example of how genres can feed into one another in different circumstances with very, very small changes. There we go. Here is the end of Shakespeare and maybe Middleton. Alcibiades is reading the epitaphs, and you can see that just as in the original, Plutarch. We've got two epitaphs here, that they're actually slightly contradictory, which doesn't come out in the Shakespeare. They're given as two different versions by different people in Plutarch, but it is nonetheless a very clear echo of Plutarch. And again, Paul Schofield as Tymon, Simon Russell Beale as Tymon, Rupert Penry Jones as Alcibiades. There are the references. I'm very happy to provide or to have those. Amy has the slides, so you can have a deeper look at those anytime you like. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And that was the virtual audience applauding. Oh, I can take off my mask because I'm speaking. Yeah, thank you so much again, Judith, and for covering such a huge range of things. And thanks for my visual material self for including so many of the fabulous ancient images as well as the modern ones. I saw Rachel smiling and you put Liz Taylor on. I've asked my colleague Andreas Gabrielatos to field the questions if he'd like to come up, and he's picking up as fast too.
It's the first time I'm doing the Zoom, but yeah, thank you so much for a wonderful talk and an excellent paper. It is customary in our seminars, after the seminars, the questions first to be asking the students first to be asking any questions. So I was wondering if any of our students have any questions they would like to ask, either present here or online. Clara, please.
We see tragedy in some of the lives, maybe not all of them. Do you think there's significance to which ones are chosen to put tragedy into, or is it just fit it better or perfect?
I think it's a very interesting question because quite clearly it isn't the case that you only get it in Greek lives, for example. By some of the best examples of the Roman lives. I do think that sometimes it's suggested by the what he sees as the character of the hero, that there's just this sort of sense of excess, and he mentions that at the beginning of Demetrius and then Antony, of course, and Tim Duff has a really excellent piece on this. Great natures put forward great vices as well as great virtues, and sort of the bigness of the emotions in tragedy clearly makes it a suitable discourse around that. It's a bit more unexpected when he introduces the comedy as the counterpoint in one sense. But I think it crops up in an awful lot of different places, and there isn't necessarily a rule of thumb about it. I think sometimes he is composing lives in groups, not just pairs, but groups of pairs, or groups of half pairs, if that makes sense. And one of the interesting things about the Spartan Lives, for example, we wouldn't necessarily think the Spartans would be good tragedy folky, really. But actually in the Agus Cleomenes, which is the sort of latest pair, chronologically they're the latest Spartans that he talks about, there's a lot of tragedy at the end. There are lots of very emotional speeches, particularly by women, and not short speeches, but long ones. And there's one which is introduced with this with the word potniao, and that actually literally means they sort of say "oh potnia," as you do in a tragedy. So this woman is tragedizing, really, specifically as a princess, as a Spartan princess. so you know, you actually at the end of the Cleomenes, you get a description of the Spartans as having undergone a tragedy. So I think he's quite capable of applying it to pretty much anybody if it seems appropriate. Are there any that it's just not appropriate? Yes. I mean, I don't think he's ever going to see Marius as a tragic figure. That's a problem about Marius, whom he is about almost the only person he writes about he doesn't, on some level, like and respect, I think. And of course, Marius's hatred of all things, or what Plutarch presents as Marius's hatred of all things Greek and Greek culture in particular, it just doesn't seem to work. But then I think that he also sees Marius as a really somebody who is tremendously successful but can't accept his own success. So there's a bit at the end where he sort of said, well, you know, come on, he's 5 times consul and he's wailing about how miserable he is all the time. Why would you do that? So there are people that just don't fit the pattern. But I think it's usually got more to do with their personalities, loaded term, but their characterization than it has to do with where they come from or the period at which the life was composed. And I think he was doing this all the way through. Thank you. Good question.
Thank you, Judith. I was wondering if any others of our students or perhaps the audience would, yeah, Nick, please.
To what extent do you think it does detract from the historical element of that Epithel?
It's a very big and complicated question. I actually think that it could, to some extent, improve our historical insights, because it seems like quite a prevalent ancient way of thinking about how the world works. There is actually a bit of Plato, funnily enough. He says, so now our argument shows that in mournings and tragedies and comedies, not merely on the stage, but in all the tragedy and comedy of life and in countless other ways, pain is mixed with pleasure. And so thinking of, I mean, that's the very beginning of the sort of all the world's a stage metaphor. In one sense, it's very striking that it should come from Socrates. It's the Philebus. I think that given that is a perception that goes from Greek society all the way through from Plato right up to someone like Plutarch or Lucian, for that matter, I think that at least it tends to make us feel that that's a way of perceiving that they genuinely used. It doesn't tell you much about the external facts of the case necessarily, but it might tell you something quite historically important about how people felt about things. I think I should leave it there. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions? Barbara, please.
Thanks very much, Judy. That was very enjoyable. And just going back to folk being assassinated in theatres, it's not partly because theatres are used for other events as well, or is it because in antiquity they all go around with a really heightened sense of drama and put themselves as stars, you know?
Well, I think I have to say I think Philip probably regarded himself with a heightened sense of drama. I think, as far as I know, the 13th Olympian thing is meant to be real, and if you declare yourself the 13th Olympian, I think it shows a certain amount of what people in Cheshire call thrush. And I think, I do think that, I mean, Caniotis has written very interestingly about this, that there does seem to be, and for that matter, Jane Hornblower's book on the Grand Procession of Ptolemy Philadelphus, that you do have these occasions where people genuinely went to town and produced these mythologically symbolic occasions. And the procession is obviously not in the theatre, but and we've even with Euripides, we've got the Archelaus, and that has to have something to do with King Archelaus. We've got people wanting to put on a show and being prepared to pay for it, and I think that sense of using the spectacle to make yourself important in one way or another, it goes right back to Phae leading Pisistratus into Athens somehow. Although, I mean, okay, sorry, that's a dangerous assumption, but I'm sure that Hellenistic readers of Herodotus thought that that's what was going on. I think the sense that you're playing an important part. It's very difficult to talk about this metaphor without using the metaphor, but the sense that you're somehow a figure around whom others gather and who will make things happen in the same way that a tragic hero is, seems very difficult to shake. And I do think there is a sense in which it begins to be very important what people are wearing, so costume comes into play, what they say, what the backdrop is, what other people are doing. My sense is that this begins with Alexander, in the sense that it really gets going. But Philip is obviously making moves in that direction. I do also think, though, that, well, you saw with Herodes and that crowd, there's never a dull moment, is there? Somebody who's always killing some family member somewhere. And again, that, you know, the discourse of tragedy where, let's face it, enough work to keep most social workers busy for years. You can really see that the savagery of it all and the likelihood of dying maybe makes people more inclined to envision things as a tragedy. And all these kingdoms around the Mediterranean, this kind of thing is happening. Replicated again and again. Maybe the Parthians are particularly lurid, but we all remember the Emperor Augustus. The Emperor Augustus's pun in Greek. I would rather be Herod's hous than his huios. I would rather be his pig than his son, because Herod, being Jewish, of course, couldn't eat pork. Didn't stop him killing quite a lot of his children. You know, this whole way of thinking about the acts of tyrants actually probably is beginning to be sketched out in Herodotus, and by the Hellenistic period, it's absolutely rampant, I think. So I think the short answer is I think it's a bit of both. Thank you.
Thank you. We're having, is it okay, Krista, if we go to an online question first? Or do you have to run? Krista, do you have some? From our audience online, James Lloyd would like to ask you. Hello, James.
Hello. James. Hi. Thank you so much. I learned a lot of that, a lot of interesting things there. And also incredibly excited for the Spartan Plutarch volume. So I'm kind of interested in what Plutarch has to say on the kind of music side of things, and what he brings, particularly kind of this legacy of Platonic ideas of musical ethos theory and stuff like that. I wonder do you see this working in a kind of complementary manner to how he thinks about tragedy, in the sense that when tragedy moves from a representation of something to being actually that thing, that's when it's bad, in the sense that the wrong kind of music can also have a very real world consequence for those who perform it or listen to it.
Yes, I think I would agree with that. I think there are some. I mean, music. I haven't really thought about this, and it's very interesting. But there are sort of some uses of music which, especially in some of the prefaces, where he talks about music as a sort of moral indicator. And actually, again, in the beginning of the Demetrius and Antony, he says, you teach someone by saying you shouldn't play like that, you should play like that. And so I'm going to give you a couple of lives of bad people so that you can learn how to be good more effectively. But there are also some areas where people say, no, I don't want to learn to play the flute because that's beneath me, because I'm too manly for that. That sounds, I think that's Alcibiades. It's floating around in my head as Alcibiades. The whole business of what kind of music you play, does come up, but much less overtly. I would have to say, but it can be used, as everything else can for Plutarch, as a way of describing what a person's like. Definitely.
Yeah. So the Alcibiades, as a kid, he doesn't want to play the aulos, and then famously comes back into Athens with the aulos players accompanying the triremes and that sort of stuff.
Yes.
Brilliant.
And the music at Demetrius's funeral, actually, you're saying the funeral of Demetrius is actually, again, very sort of theatrical, but it's also genuinely moving, and the music is all part of that they sort of play him home. And it's not only Demetrius being a bit of a drama king, it is genuinely that people are sad about him because they actually do like him, which is a big thing he has in common with Antony. So yes, that's absolutely right. Thank you for reminding me of that.
Brilliant, thank you. I'll have to look into the Demetrius passage. I wasn't aware of that one. Thanks.
It's right at the very end, when he's being buried in Athens. It is rather nice.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you, James. Krista.
Thank you. That's real.
Thank you for waiting.
I'm a bit surprised that Emma doesn't have a hand up, depending on what the Thessalian.
Sorry.
But I was thinking of something that really should have struck me a long time ago and hadn't really before you talked about Plutarch kind of trying to find the middle way between Platonic rejection of poetry, tragedy in particular, and of course the wholehearted embracing of it for everything. And that's how analogous this debate is in some ways with, the Christian debates in the 4th century around the uses of pagan literature. And I wonder if the common ground is really in the fact that tragedy is sort of human action and pagan literature sort of is human language, and you can't really get around those things. So that's why people kind of keep banging on about them and sort of trying to distance themselves and prove their purity and then relapse and try to defend that.
I think that's a really interesting analogy. Not one that has ever occurred to me, but I think there's a lot in it, and quite honestly, I think it's very likely to be true, because I think an awful lot of this is very heavily internalised among educated Greeks and Romans, and the education system doesn't change so very much for an awfully long time. So if not only you, but all the people who are teaching you have learnt this sort of thought system, it's very easy to observe patterns from a newer belief system within it, which comfort you about the things that aren't thought to be correct anymore. If you see, so you're still looking at the same framework, you're just it's developed and it's gone in a different direction. But it's not that you need to reject everything you've always been brought up with. I suppose that I would say that I think in the reception of Plutarch, there's a tendency among people like the 16th century translators to write in their prefaces things like, look, I know he's a pagan and all of these people are pagans, but we can learn from them. And then you, O mighty monarch, will be even better because you're a Christian. And there's a sense of doubling up on ancient virtue plus Christianity, absolutely sort of invincible combination. But that doesn't. I suppose they feel they have to address the question. But there's no real resistance there, and to the sense that the moral system is not rebarbative. At least it's and this works particularly well with Plutarch, I think.
Yeah, and it's interesting, or sometimes that's a live issue and everyone's really exercised about it, and sometimes it's just a trope. It's like, yeah, we have to go through those emotions and defend it, but you know, we're all on the same side and we're basically fine.
Yeah, no, and I think he's easy for a very wide variety of societies and characters to find that they're on the same page. Because he's not usually extreme, and he's usually espousing a sort of middle way, and a sense of seeking for genuine moral virtue as opposed to something more specious.
Are there any more questions? Oliver.
Yes, thank you. That was fantastic. You made in your introduction, you were talking, of course, about the traces of tragedy in history, and even of the idea of the tragic historians, and how that then feeds, of course, into Plutarch himself. I was wondering, and this is truly wondering, if there are any traces perhaps of the contrary option, and that is traces of historical tragedy in Plutarch, given that, of course, not only is there a Greek tradition of historical tragedies, but of course he comes just after the great moments of Roman historical tragedy. So I was wondering if by any chance there was some sort of trace there in that sense.
That's, again, a really good and interesting question. I think, I mean, he definitely refers to some of the historical tragedies that we know about, and particularly Phrynicus. And that does come up a couple of times. So I mean, he's both a critical and an avid reader of Herodotus. So he's all over anything that's mentioned in Herodotus. And he does talk about Phrynicus as the fall of Miletus. I'd have to check and see whether he ever mentions the Gyges, but I suspect he doesn't, because I don't know that anybody does mention the actual fragment we've got. But I do get the sense, I mean, for example, in the Artaxerxes, I think he feels that that whole atmosphere, that sort of Orientalist atmosphere around the Persian court that you get in Herodotus up to a point, and Ctesias clearly, and that would have been part of the Gyges tragedy as well. That sort of very fervid atmosphere that Greeks like to conjure up about Persian court life, that comes out very strongly. And the sense of Artaxerxes as as a not terribly adequate tragic heroes is actually quite strong in that half, I think. So I think that's I think the closest I can get to a proper answer of that. As far as his interaction with Seneca is, well, I was thinking of Seneca when you said Roman historical tragedy, but that might not.
Of course, we know that tragedies about Romulus and Remus, for example. I mean, they're lost to us, but they might not have been lost to Plutarch. I mean, I know this is a bit, of course, a very strange way of kind of tracing it, but would there be maybe a productive?
Well, there's some very interesting stuff on Romulus and Remus in the Romulus, but it's strangely untragic. I think actually it's more almost antiquarian, and I'm also. I mean, he does paraphrase a bit of Horace at one point, but how much he would have looked at Roman tragedy, I'm not honestly sure. He does, and he's also, I mean, he clearly knows Latin, because he sort of paraphrases Veni Vidi Vici, and he paraphrases this bit of Horace as well, and he gets it right. You know, it's all, he obviously hasn't got it wrong, and occasionally he quotes Latin in Greek letters in the text. There's code switching of a sort. He doesn't use Roman letters, and it would be a brave editor that put them in, but he does sort of use the Greek for Latin words and quote them. So he would have been capable of reading Roman tragedy, but it's always very difficult to tell when you find something whether he's really talking about, say, Roman comedy, because again he refers to things that could be Roman comedy, but they could also be Menander. So it's a bewildering thing, because you don't want to minimise what somebody with Plutarch's brain would have read, and at the same time I'm just not sure what would have come his way. I'm quite sure that he read a lot of Livy. So whether he was getting his Roman tragedy sort of second-hand from Livy.
Any other questions? Well, we do have time. Oh, Emma, yes.
I'm not going to say anything about the thing, refute angrily this accusation of England. You know, I have a question about tragic colouring. I mean, it's a really basic one, but do you think in some cases where we detect tragic colouring in something like the Diodorus text, what we're actually seeing is a sort of storytelling shape which probably occurs in lots of cultures, and that tragedy is picking up on developing those sort of stories about people getting too big for their boots and then being cast down? And is that just a sort of universal motif?
I think it's very tricky. The earlier you go, the trickier it gets. I think there are enough passages in where somebody actually says it was just like a tragedy. Although I don't actually think Diodorus goes that far, but he does say something along the lines of, and so it was in the theatre that he does sort of draw the attention. I think it's very difficult to purge tragic colouring from that particular passage. It's quite easy to. I think there are a lot of passages where it's quite marginal, and I would want to try and pin it down. And you don't. Then there are some other things which are pretty clear signals. I mean, obviously I was talking about Plutarch, not things like the ancient novel, but there are a lot of passages in the ancient novel where the speech is introduced with "et tragodicen." He made a tragic speech. So okay, I think I'm prepared to put a tick in that particular box. but certainly you can't just say, I don't think you can say of any story where either the Herodotean stories like Adrastus, where attempting to run away from your fate just means that you bring it about. Clearly that is what happens to Oedipus, but there's no theatrical imagery in there, and that could perfectly well be something that sort of the ancient Greeks just thought there was something out there and that was out to get them. But you know that it's a common feeling of nameless dread and futility in the face of something much stronger than you are. I tend to feel that there is an abundance of places where it is pretty strongly hooked into tragedy, and there is another subset of that where it's strongly hooked into theatricality. And it's certainly true that theatricality obviously isn't quite the same. And apart from anything else, I think there are also a few places in Plutarch where he's picking up on things like pantomime, potentially, although it's hard to be sure. But he does talk about pantomime in the table talk, so he knows what it is, and he's been to see it, I think. So there are performance genres of various kinds that flit through the text. I think he probably gets most excited by tragedy, comedy number 2, and the others less so. But you can see how that would be when you're telling a very strong story.
Thank you, Ma. You think?
I'll say a few things about upcoming things before
Sure.
we lose our online and everyone else's audience. Well, thank you again.
Thank you so much.
Judith.
Thank
That's
you.
fabulous. Thank you. For those of you who came in person, we will have a chance to continue to ask questions and talk about exciting things over a little wine and some nibbles down the hallway. So our pop-up nibbles, as they are. So please join us for that in a moment. And I just wanted to make it's a little bit confusing. We've got a lot coming up. And as if there's not enough, our colleagues in history are doing their Stenton lecture. Sadia Qureshi, I think, is speaking tomorrow. The Stenton lecture is the big history lecture of the year. And I just wanted to do a shout out for that because that's about looking back at the past and relevant to all of us. I can't remember the exact title, but that's going to be tomorrow. So Rohan Devroy, or contact me and I can get you in touch with him if you don't know about how to do that. But for our seminars, apologies, I didn't make this clear earlier. The last of our seminars actually for the department lecture is going to be 2 weeks from now. And so that's going to be Chigdem Manor speaking, yeah, that's the first. She's going to be speaking about southeastern Konya. So that's going to be big picture, 3rd to 1st millennium BC, geography and all that kind of thing. So we'll have that to look forward to, again, a fortnight from now. But next week, we have the last of the Troy in the 21st Century Europe Museum lectures, the last in the series coming from Kasia Marciniak from Poland, who's going to be talking about Troy in children's literature. She's part of the, oh gosh, I forgot the big EU-funded project. Anyways, dealing with children's literature and amongst everything, Our Mythical Childhood, that's what it's called. Anyway, so those are our last 2 talks in our 2 conjoined seminar series that we're expecting our MA students to come to. And the final one in the Europe Museum Seminar Series was cancelled because our former colleague and student Sadie Pickup is actually going to withdraw because she's with child, not with child yet. That's what it's called. Yeah, and so that's a good reason to draw, to pull out the if you're expecting a baby, so it's really next week is a big deal. And the week after, and then it's all over and done with. But next week's a big deal because we have the Euro seminar, which is our yearly big important seminar to which we invite someone to speak on something that Percy Ure did once upon a time. And next week we're having, for those who didn't realize that Percy Ure, as well as doing Thucydides and Greek pottery and all that, he also did Justinian. And so we've got Peter Saris coming to talk about the time of Justinian persecuting society. If you haven't seen the posters, we haven't advertised them enough. I've been sending it around circular lists and so forth. Do sign up on tinyurl.com/yourlecture11. We're going to do it digital, but more important, and especially online, in person, in the Van Emden building, Van Emden room, lecture theater of the same building, Edith Morley down the hallway. So if anyone's confused about all that, just send me an email and I'll try to get back to you. But hopefully it's all been posted, and our lovely Danya Kamini has been doing a very good job of circulating it on social media and the blog and so forth. So just remember, next Wednesday, next Thursday, and the following Wednesday, 4 o'clock. Oh, 5 o'clock the next Thursday, and then we'll all be happy. Okay, thanks for that. Sorry that took so long, and especially sorry to today's speaker, but she's had a moment to rest before her wine and nibbles. So down to room 40 with all of the rest of you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I hope so. The only thing is that I missed the first, when I snuck up at the just get rid of this. I have to dismiss, and I have to.
And I'm sorry I didn't get the chance to introduce myself beforehand. It was great to meet you. I've also had a question for you, but I think you've all got too tired with all the questions.